Las Vegas, the mid-1990s. At one of the most exclusive casino hotels on the Strip, in a private gaming room that has been closed to the public for the evening, a man is playing baccarat with a minimum bet of $1 million per hand. He is not dressed to impress. He does not need to impress anyone. The casino has sent its most senior executives to greet him personally. The pit bosses have been replaced for the evening by managers who do not normally work the floor. The standard credit lines do not apply here, because the standard credit lines were designed for people with less money than this man has, and the gap between his resources and the casino's most generous credit arrangement is, in practical terms, unbridgeable. His family name is Bolkiah. He is a prince of the royal house of Brunei. He comes from a country smaller than the state of Delaware, sitting on the northern coast of the island of Borneo in the South China Sea. The country has a population of fewer than 500,000 people. It also sits on top of one of the most significant oil and natural gas deposits in Southeast Asia, a geological accident of fortune that has made the ruling family of Brunei, across the second half of the 20th century, among the wealthiest human beings who have ever lived. The money involved in what unfolded across the 1980s and 1990s in Las Vegas, in London, in Paris, in New York, across hotel suites and casino floors and private parties and business ventures that consumed hundreds of millions of dollars without producing a single viable product, runs, by the most conservative estimates, into the billions. $5 billion by some accounts, spread across years of spending so extreme and so systematic that it eventually provoked a lawsuit filed by one brother against another, a lawsuit that exposed to the world the mechanics of how an oil fortune the size of a small country's GDP can be consumed by a single human appetite. This is the story of the House of Bolkiah, of Sultan Hassan al-Bolkiah, the man who was, for a period in the 1980s and 90s, widely considered the wealthiest individual on earth, and of his younger brother, Prince Geoffrey Bolkiah, the man who set out to spend as much of that wealth as physics and time would allow. It is a story about what absolute abundance looks like when it meets absolute appetite. It is a story that begins with oil, runs through casinos and palaces and yachts and lawsuits, and ends in a courtroom settlement that was sealed from public view, leaving most of its most important questions permanently unanswered. The Sultanate of Brunei Darussalam, to give it its full name, is not a place most people in the Western world could find quickly on a map. It sits on the northwest coast of Borneo, divided into two non-contiguous sections by the Malaysian state of Sarawak. It became a British protectorate in 1888 and gained full independence in 1984. It is an absolute monarchy. The Sultan is the head of state, head of government, and prime minister simultaneously. Democratic institutions exist in a limited and ceremonial capacity. Power flows from the throne. It always has. What changed everything in the middle of the 20th century was oil. The discovery of significant oil deposits in Brunei in the 1920s, and the subsequent development of those resources through the decades that followed, transformed the country from a modest colonial territory into an extraordinary generator of wealth. By the time of independence in 1984, Brunei was producing around 150,000 barrels of oil per day, along with significant quantities of liquefied natural gas. The revenues from these resources flowed, through the mechanisms of an absolute monarchy, substantially to the state and to the ruling family. The man sitting at the top of this arrangement in 1984 was Hassan al-Bolkiah, the 29th Sultan of Brunei, born in 1946, educated partly at the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst in England, and in possession of a personal fortune that analysts during the 1980s placed in the range of $25 to $40 billion, a number that fluctuated with oil prices and investment values, but that consistently placed him at or near the top of global wealth rankings. Several years in the 1980s, he was listed by Forbes and other publications as the single wealthiest person in the world. He was also, by the standards of his position and his religion, Brunei is an Islamic state, and the Sultan takes his faith seriously, a relatively conservative figure. He did not gamble, he did not drink, he built mosques. He was known for large-scale charitable donations, for funding Islamic education, for presenting himself as a Muslim ruler of a Muslim country who governed according to Islamic principles. He would, in later years, implement elements of Sharia criminal law in Brunei, drawing international condemnation, but reflecting a worldview that was, at its core, genuinely religious. His younger brother was a different matter entirely. Prince Geoffrey Bolkiah was born in 1954, 8 years after his brother. He was educated in England. He was charming and handsome and possessed in abundance the quality that makes a man dangerous when he is also very wealthy. A complete inability to feel that anything is enough. He became Brunei's Minister of Finance, a position that placed him in direct control of, among other things, the Brunei Investment Agency, the sovereign wealth fund through which the country's oil revenues were invested internationally. The Brunei Investment Agency managed assets at its peak estimated in the range of $30 to $40 billion. It was one of the largest pools of managed capital in Asia. It invested in real estate, in equities, in financial instruments, across multiple continents. It required a finance minister of discipline and probity, someone who understood that the assets being managed were a national trust, the inheritance of a small country and its future generations, not a personal account. Geoffrey understood this. He simply did not apply the understanding. What happened to the assets of the Brunei Investment Agency across the 1980s and 90s is, in the official version of events established by subsequent litigation, a story of systematic diversion. Money moved from the agency's accounts into accounts controlled by Geoffrey. Money moved from those accounts into business ventures that existed, in some cases, primarily as vehicles for expenditure. Money moved into casino accounts, into the operating costs of a lifestyle that was, even by the standards of Middle Eastern oil royalty, a peer group not known for austerity, extraordinary. The spending was extraordinary on several dimensions simultaneously. The first was automotive. Geoffrey is reported to have accumulated a car collection of more than 2,000 vehicles, a number so large that it required specially constructed facilities to house them and a full-time staff to maintain them. Not ordinary luxury vehicles, Ferraris, Lamborghinis, Bentleys, Rolls-Royces, in colors and configurations that did not exist in standard production and had been custom manufactured to his specifications. He ordered cars the way other people order meals, and the collection expanded continuously across the years of his financial peak. The second dimension was maritime. He commissioned a yacht named the Tits, a name chosen apparently without any particular strategic intent, simply because it was the name he chose. The vessel came with 2 smaller tenders, named, correspondingly, Nipple 1 and Nipple 2. The yacht was among the largest private vessels in the world at the time of its construction. Its operating costs alone ran into the millions per year. The third dimension was real estate. He owned palaces in Brunei, not one but multiple, furnished with gold fixtures, commissioned art, furniture imported from manufacturers who had never before had a client with this specific combination of wealth and impracticality. He owned properties in London. He pursued real estate projects in New York. He funded the development of the Beau Brunei Hotel project in Manhattan, a venture that consumed enormous sums and produced, ultimately, very little. The fourth dimension, which ran alongside all the others, was gambling. Las Vegas knew Prince Geoffrey. This must be said with appropriate precision. The documentation of specific sessions, specific losses, specific nights is not part of the public record in the way that, for example, Terence Watanabe's losses were eventually disclosed through regulatory filings. What is documented is the fact of his presence, the scale at which he played, and the reputation he accumulated across the casino industry during the years of his peak spending. He was, in the vocabulary of casino operators who discussed him in the 1980s and 90s, a player of a category that most casinos had no standard framework for accommodating. He was beyond whale. He was beyond the systems of credit lines and comp arrangements and VIP hosts that casinos maintain for their wealthiest regular players. He required a different kind of relationship entirely. The private gaming rooms, the suspended standard rules, the minimum bets calibrated to his scale rather than the casino's standard highest tier, these accommodations were made for Geoffrey in Las Vegas and in London and in the other cities where he played. The amounts that moved across the tables in those private sessions across the years are estimated in the hundreds of millions of dollars. Whether those hundreds of millions contributed materially to the total figure, the 5 billion that various accounts attach to the full scope of the spending, is difficult to establish with precision because the full accounting was never made public. But there is another dimension of the Jeffrey story that complicates the straightforward narrative of a prince gambling away his country's oil money. Because Jeffrey was not only gambling, he was also investing, or attempting to invest, in ways that consistently produced losses rather than returns. His business ventures were numerous, ambitious, and almost uniformly unsuccessful. Among them was Amadeo, a company established with the stated intention of building a new type of luxury car, a super sports car that would compete with Ferrari at the very top of the market. Amadeo employed engineers and designers and technicians, rented facilities, commissioned prototypes. It consumed enormous sums across its years of operation. It never produced a car that went into production. There were other ventures, hospitality projects, financial investments, development schemes across multiple countries. What they shared was a pattern: capital in, very little out, and a principal investor who did not apply the scrutiny to these projects that the amounts involved demanded. Because scrutiny implies the possibility of refusal. And Jeffrey Bolkia had spent decades in an environment where refusal was not a concept that applied to him. By the mid-1990s, the situation was becoming impossible to ignore even from the outside. Reports were emerging, in the financial press, in the British newspapers that tracked the activities of the wealthy with particular diligence, that the Brunei Investment Agency was significantly depleted, that assets which should have been generating returns were absent from the accounts where they should have appeared, that the gap between what the agency was supposed to hold and what it actually held was, when examined, a number measured in billions. And then came the lawsuits. In 1997, Shannon Marketic, a former Miss USA, filed a civil lawsuit in Los Angeles against Prince Jeffrey, alleging that she had been recruited to Brunei under the pretense of legitimate entertainment work and held against her will. The lawsuit, and the others filed by women in similar circumstances, generated global headlines and placed the activities of the Brunei royal family under a level of public scrutiny that absolute monarchies are not designed to withstand. The litigation was eventually settled under confidential terms, but the Marketic lawsuit was, in retrospect, a preview of the larger legal reckoning that was coming. In 1998, Sultan Hassan al-Bolkiah took the step that no one inside the royal family could have expected. He sued his own brother. The Sultan, acting through the Brunei government and through the Brunei Investment Agency, filed a civil lawsuit against Prince Jeffrey in the British courts, alleging misappropriation of agency assets in the range of $14.8 billion. $14.8 billion. The number, when it appeared in court documents, reframed everything. It was not a rounding error. It was not a bookkeeping discrepancy. It was, if accurate, one of the largest individual acts of financial embezzlement in recorded history, a diversion of national assets that made the comparison to ordinary gambling losses seem almost beside the point. The $5 billion that circulates in accounts of Jeffrey's Las Vegas and casino spending was, by this framing, a subset of a much larger total. One category of expenditure among many, all drawing from the same systematically plundered source. The lawsuit proceeded through the British legal system and generated extensive documentation of what Jeffrey had spent money on. The cars, the yachts, the properties, the business ventures, the women, the gambling, the full catalog of expenditure across 15 years of operating, as if the Brunei Investment Agency's assets were a personal account with no bottom. The evidence assembled by the Sultan's legal team was described by those who saw portions of it as staggering in its detail and in its scope. In 2000, the case was settled. Jeffrey agreed to return assets, properties, holdings, physical objects of value to the Brunei government. The exact terms of the settlement were sealed. The precise amount returned, the precise amount never recovered, the final accounting of what the $14.8 billion had actually become, these figures did not emerge from the settlement into public view. The case closed on terms that satisfied the Sultan sufficiently to discontinue the proceedings, and the world was left with the outline of the story, but not its arithmetic. What happened to Jeffrey after the settlement was a recalibration, Significant by the standards of ordinary life, modest by the standards of what he had been. He retained significant assets. He was not prosecuted criminally. This was a civil matter between brothers, resolved in civil terms. He continued to live at a level of luxury that most human beings cannot imagine, reduced from what it had been, but still extraordinary in absolute terms. He remained a prince of the royal house of Brunei. His brother remained sultan. The two men, by various accounts over the subsequent years, gradually reconstructed a relationship that the lawsuit had placed under severe strain. Geoffrey was seen at official Brunei events. He was photographed alongside the Sultan on state occasions. The public reconciliation was performed with the smooth efficiency that royal families bring to the management of inconvenient facts. The lawsuit was not mentioned. The 14.8 billion was not discussed. The Brunei Investment Agency continued to operate. Brunei's oil reserves, while finite and declining, continued to generate revenues. The country remained extraordinarily wealthy by the standards of its size and population. The Sultan continued to rule. The mosques continued to be built, and the private gaming rooms of Las Vegas, the ones that had been prepared for a prince who arrived without notice and played baccarat at $1 million per hand until the night ran out, those rooms are still there, still available, still ready to accommodate a player whose resources require a different set of arrangements than the standard ones. No player of Geoffrey's scale has replaced him in the intervening years. The casino industry, which maintains its own oral history of the great gamblers and the great sessions, still references the Brunei royal family when the conversation turns to the upper limits of what a single player can represent. Not in terms of winnings or losses in any documented single session, but in terms of the sustained, systematic, years-long engagement with gambling as one component of a lifestyle operating at a scale that has, in the decades since, not been replicated. The $5 billion. The number exists in reporting and in accounts and in the oral history of Las Vegas. Its precise composition, how much was gambling, how much was investment losses, how much was the cars and the yachts and the Amadeo engineers who built a car that was never sold, is not publicly established in a single authoritative document. What is established, in the court record that survived the settlement before it was sealed, is that a man with access to one of the great sovereign wealth funds of the late 20th century treated it as a personal instrument, and that the instrument, by the time anyone formally intervened, had been used to generate expenditure on a scale that no individual human life, no matter how long or how ambitious, could have produced through legitimate means. The oil is still there, some of it. Brunei's reserves are projected to be substantially depleted within the coming decades, a timeline that the country's leadership is aware of and has begun, with varying degrees of urgency, to plan around. The wealth that made the Bolkiah family the subject of fascination for a generation of Western journalists and casino executives was always at its foundation a finite resource, oil pulled from the ground at a rate that the ground cannot indefinitely sustain. Prince Geoffrey lives quietly now by the standards of his earlier years. He appears occasionally in the press, a legal dispute here, a property matter there, the occasional photograph at a public event in Brunei. He is in his late 60s. The cars, most of them, are gone. The settlement with the Sultan required the return of assets that included substantial portions of the collection. What remains is a reduced but still significant fortune, the rump of a spending spree that lasted 15 years and consumed, by any reasonable accounting, a sum that most countries would consider a meaningful fraction of their national wealth. There is no dramatic ending to the story of Prince Geoffrey Bolkiah. No bankruptcy, no prison, no courtroom confession. There is a sealed settlement, a diplomatic reconciliation, and a life that continues at a level of comfort that the consequences of his actions did not ultimately touch in the way that consequences touch ordinary people. This is the specific privilege of royal birth. The scale of the disaster is enormous. The personal cost is modest. The $14.8 billion alleged in the lawsuit, whatever portion of it was real, whatever portion was recovered, whatever portion remains unaccounted for in the sealed arithmetic of the settlement, that money came ultimately from the oil beneath the ground of a country of fewer than 500,000 people. It was their inheritance as much as the Sultan's. Whether they received it, what became of it, where it went across the casino floors and the car showrooms, and the yacht builder's invoices? These are questions that the sealed settlement will not answer. The baccarat hands are played. The dice are thrown. The settlement is signed. The oil, meanwhile, keeps running out. There is no number large enough and no vault deep enough to change that particular arithmetic.